I want to begin with two Smith quotations. Being an historian rather than an economist, I've actually read The Wealth of Nations. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. And this is an extraordinary passage in Book 1, Chapter 9 about China. China seems to have been long stationary and had probably long ago acquired that full complement of riches which is consistent with the nature of its laws and institutions. But this complement may be much inferior to what, with other laws and institutions, the nature of its soil, climate, and situation might admit of. A country which neglects or despises foreign commerce, and which admits the vessels of foreign nations into one or two of its ports only, cannot transact the same quantity of business which it might do with different laws and institutions. In a country, too, where, though the rich or the owners of large capitals enjoy a good deal of security, the poor or the owners of small capitals enjoy scarce any, but are liable under the pretense of justice to be pillaged and plundered at any time by the inferior mandarins, the quantity of stock employed in all the different branches of business transacted within it can never be equal to what the nature and extent of that business might admit. Smith was right about so much that it's hard to keep track of all the things he was right about. When I was writing a book entitled Civilization, I came across this passage and realized that it encapsulated the argument that I was attempting to make. Smith had already worked it all out in the 1770s. What made China appear economically stationary in the late 18th century, which we know from more recent research it was, stationary in the sense that per capita income wasn't growing at all, but had in fact been shrinking and would continue to shrink into the 19th century, was nothing specific to Chinese culture, nothing specific to the Chinese race, but had to do with China's laws and institutions. Smith's central argument here is that if you change the laws and institutions, and in particular, if you introduced trade, free trade in particular, to China, you would have quite different outcomes. You would very likely have rapid growth. Eventually, policy changes in China after the 1970s proved Smith right. It's an astonishingly insightful passage, and it sums up, I think, what came to be the institutional school of economics. It's really a kind of Doug North passage. But as you all know, the theory of moral sentiments, the earlier work, is just as important a contribution by Smith. And so here's another crucial quote. This is from towards the end of the book, part 6, section 2, chapter 2. The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts, without any regard either to the great interest or the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously, and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder. What genius! Smith understands, even before the era of economic planning, even before the great visions of utopia that came along in the 19th century and caused so much havoc in the 20th, that the grand figure of the planner, who imagines himself master of the chessboard of society, will only wreak havoc if he goes against the grain of the motive forces of the individual human chess pieces. It's all there. And that's why when David invited me to come to speak at this conference, I accepted. Because I sometimes feel that we still underestimate the extent of Smith's genius, the profundity of his thinking. It was as if Smith saw modernity coming and realized all the mistakes that we would make in it and tried, albeit vainly, to warn us against them. So Smith was right about the invisible hand, right about the market, but also right about the way in which civil society operates, the way we relate to one another through what we now call empathy, but he called sympathy. Why then did, in the mid-20th century, Joseph Schumpeter express such pessimistic views about the future of what one might call a Smithian order? If you read Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which he wrote between 1938 and 1942, you realize how deeply pessimistic Schumpeter was about those things that Smith held dear. Can capitalism survive? Schumpeter asked. No, I do not think it can. Can socialism work? Of course it can. Schumpeter made 4 points about why he thought this. One is very famous, that capitalism operates on the basis of creative destruction, a good thing, but a highly disruptive one, and therefore potentially a source of resistance. Secondly, he made a point familiar since Marx's work, that capitalism tends towards monopoly and corporatism, not competition. Thirdly, he made the very correct observation that capitalism creates, educates, and subsidizes a vested interest in social unrest, namely intellectuals. And finally, Schumpeter argued, socialism is politically irresistible, both to bureaucrats and democratic politicians. And this was why Schumpeter was pessimistic about what lay ahead in the post-Second World War world and anticipated that socialism would win and capitalism would lose. These are not bad points. As you'll see, we may find ourselves revisiting these arguments if, as I'm going to argue, socialism is making a comeback. I've already made one jibe at the economics profession. Here's another. The most influential textbook of macroeconomics, the one I was told to read when I was an undergraduate at Oxford in the 1980s, was Paul Samuelson's book. That book consistently and wrongly predicted that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in economic terms at some point in the foreseeable future. In the 1961 edition, Samuelson argued that Soviet gross national product would exceed that of the United States between 1984 and 1997. They pushed back the date of sorpasso to 2002 to 2012 in the 1980 edition. And this chart appeared in successive editions of the book, a book inflicted on generations of innocents in American economics departments. The Soviet economy, Samuelson argued, is proof that contrary to what many skeptics had earlier believed, a socialist command economy can function and even thrive. Samuelson, Schumpeter's pupil and Nobel laureate, cannot have read Adam Smith, or at least not very closely. This was all rubbish. What actually happened was that the Soviet economy, even on a generous purchasing power parity adjusted basis, never got closer than 44% the size of the US economy, and as its growth rate slackened and finally became flat, it fell ever further behind. By 1991, at the end of its existence, its economy was less than a third the size of the United States. And I'm old enough to remember that moment of seeming triumph in 1989, when it appeared that we who had made the argument for free markets, who had made the argument against economic planning had been vindicated by the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe. If you look at a Google Ngram of references in English language publications to socialism, they fell off a cliff after 1989. And interestingly, discussion of capitalism prior to 2008 also diminished. Remember, capitalism is a term of abuse, not originally Marxist. It was actually a Tory term of abuse in the 19th century. And I urge people who believe in the free market and the principles of Smith not to use the term, because the very use of the term capitalism legitimizes its opposite, socialism. That's why they declined more or less in lockstep after it was clear that socialism was defunct. Back then, in most democracies, in most OECD countries, there was a sustained decline in marginal tax rates, marginal personal income tax rates, and corporate income tax rates as it became clear that the very high marginal tax rates of the 1960s and 1970s led to suboptimal results in terms of growth. Here again, it seemed as if the argument was being won. And yet a funny thing happened on the way to the present. That was the financial crisis. The financial crisis, which people realized was happening in late 2008, but which obviously had begun somewhat earlier, in early 2007, even late 2006, ought to have been an opportunity for the left to make a comeback, since it very clearly fit into the model of crisis as an inherent feature of capitalism. But in fact, the people who made the left-wing argument that the financial crisis happened, therefore bankers should go to jail, did much worse politically than the people on the populist right who said the financial crisis happened and therefore we should restrict immigration and impose tariffs and do other things along those lines. It's a surprising outcome when you come to think of it that the left did quite badly after 2008. Only really in Greece did the left profit from the crisis. It's only much more recently that the left has begun to make serious signs of political recovery. And what is very striking is that on both sides of the Atlantic, socialism has made a comeback amongst the young. Here are two charts to illustrate the point. The first on the left is American data from earlier this year, and it shows that although most Americans have a more positive reaction to the word capitalism than to the word socialism, by a rough 61 to 39 ratio, that's not true amongst the generation aged between 18 and 24. 61% of whom have a positive reaction to the word socialism, as compared with 58% who have a positive reaction to the word capitalism. What one sees a somewhat similar pattern in the British data. You can see here, in fact, that there's even more anti-capitalist feeling amongst British, younger British voters. And so we find a really quite significant generational polarization going on in at least the English-speaking world, where young people, and this may include your children, I don't see a great many representatives of Generation Z in the room, but your children are very probably far more attracted to socialism than you are, and more attracted to socialism than you may realize. So I want to talk about that because it seems to me that we face a really meaningful problem if the next generation, the generation in effect currently at university or of university age, believes that socialism is preferable to capitalism. Let me talk some more about why that matters. In my most recent book, The Square and the Tower, I tried to show how an age of large online social networks would be an age in which extreme ideologies would flourish along with fake news. And there's no doubt in my mind that one can't explain the rise of the populist right and more recently the populist left without reference to technology. Technology is disrupting existing structures of politics, undermining established parties, and creating opportunities for extreme ideologies to spread, especially when the leaders of the populist right and left understand better how to use social media than the centrists, the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. And one only really needs to look at these accounts, the Twitter accounts of Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Jeremy Corbyn, to appreciate that something very remarkable is happening. Boris Johnson has about 600,000 followers on Twitter, which he only joined relatively recently. That's 1% of Donald Trump's number of followers, but it's also substantially less than the 2 million Twitter followers that Jeremy Corbyn has. Corbyn is actually the #1 British politician on social media. So this is, I think, a remarkable phenomenon and not one to be underestimated. By and large, I found that people, particularly in the British media and academia, underestimate the importance of social media as if they still haven't quite learnt the lessons of 2016. Let's try and drill down and understand a bit better what is meant here. Because, of course, it depends what you mean by capitalism. When you ask Americans to express their positive or negative views of small business or entrepreneurs or free enterprise, they're far more positive about those things than they are about capitalism or, for that matter, big business. And reassuringly, they have an even more negative view of the federal government than of big business. And as a collective, including all age groups, they remain on balance skeptical about socialism. In fact, for that reason, I think it will be pretty disastrous for the Democratic candidate next year if the word socialism can be associated with that person, as I'm almost sure the Trump campaign will endeavor to do, regardless of who the nominee is. So I don't think we should jump to the wrong conclusion here. Much of what is going on here is that the word capitalism simply has negative associations, whereas small business and entrepreneurship don't. Even more interesting is to understand what Generation Z, as the Americans call it, or we'd say Generation Z. It's terribly confusing, so maybe we should probably go with iGen, which I rather prefer. iGen captures the fact that the generation circa 20 years old has grown up with smartphones and grown up with social media. They never had a time of innocence, which at least the millennials did. And they behave, I think, consequently very differently. What do they mean by socialism? Gallup has a bunch of polls about this, trying to get at what Americans understand by socialism. When they ask Democrats, you can see the answers up here: equality, government services, free healthcare. 13%, which isn't very many, of Democrats think it implies government ownership. I love the fact that 6% think that socialism means being social, including activity on social media. That's actually a relatively low proportion. Amongst young Australians, it's almost twice that. Oh, socialism? I'm on Facebook all the time, mate. The really revealing answer to the question came from AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in an interview with Anderson Cooper. What we have in mind, she said, and what my policies most closely resemble are what we see in the UK, in Norway, in Finland, in Sweden. Aha! So that's socialism for young Americans. This is pretty interesting when you actually go to Sweden, which I assume AOC has not done. Because Sweden is, in fact, a very model of a dynamic market economy. ranked 9th in the World Economic Forum's competitiveness ranking, just behind the United Kingdom, which is on 8th, 12th in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business League table, and even 19th in the Heritage Foundation's list of economic freedom. So there's a confusion clearly at work here. When young Americans talk about socialism, what they have in mind is some idealized or caricatured version of Scandinavia or Northern Europe, in which things like higher education are free, or healthcare is seemingly free. It really has nothing to do with what seems to me the central notion of socialism, which is the collective ownership of the means of production. That was the defining feature of socialism as an ideology. The argument, which Marx was not the first to make, that you needed to have some public control rather than private control of capital. It seems as if very few young people have that model in mind. It's all rich with irony to idealize Scandinavian socialism when it's in decline, or when, as in Denmark, it's simply metamorphosing into a respectable version of right-wing populism, is, I think, a huge case of lost in transatlantic translation. The reality in Europe is that social democracy, which was the respectable version of socialism that emerged after World War II, is in deep decline in almost every country. In some cases, it faces extinction. So I sense here a great deal of confusion that we need as educators to try to address. Remember, the reason that young people are confused about socialism is that nobody taught them anything about it at university. And if you don't believe me, take a look at the courses that are on offer in the major universities on both sides of the Atlantic. You will find almost nothing on what happened with all the different 20th century experiments with Marxism and its variants. There are precious few courses that might have helped educate AOC when she was at Boston University and cleared up this confusion, shown her that what happened in Scandinavia was in fact that the experiment with really large-scale social democratic intrusion in the economy was a failure and had to be abandoned after crises in the 1990s. The correct analysis is that there is a spectrum of redistribution. You can see it in these OECD data on Gini coefficients for the countries that we have data for, mostly OECD countries. What you can see here is, if you just look at the black lines at the top, inequality before taxes and transfers, and then the red inverted triangle, inequality after taxes and transfers, and then redistribution as a percentage. And you rank countries by the extent of redistribution that occurs. There is a spectrum that ranges from Chile and South Korea at the left-hand side of the chart, all the way to Finland and Ireland at the right side of the x-axis. And that is the spectrum from which each democracy gets to choose. You choose through democracy how much redistribution you want to do. And if you don't want to do much, if you essentially want to leave things as they are pre-tax, then you can be Chile. But if you want to make a really big impact and change the distribution, then you can be Ireland or Finland. That's really the discussion that we're having. It's utterly confusing to cast it in terms of socialism and capitalism, because in reality, each of these countries resembles the other in the fundamental institutions that are used to make the redistribution decision. You may think that the United States should move from the left side, here it is just next to Israel and New Zealand, you may think it should move all the way towards Finland and Ireland in terms of redistribution. Make that argument in 2020. Seek to persuade voters that that is the kind of redistribution that you should have in the United States. Good luck. I just have 10 minutes to talk about an entirely different challenge that believers in economic freedom confront today. And that is the challenge that I certainly underestimated in 1989. In 1989, I guess I was guilty of Eurocentrism. I thought that what happened in Berlin, in Gdansk, what happened in Prague, that all of this ultimately mattered more than what happened in Beijing. And we now see that this was a grave error, and that in fact we should have attached more importance to what happened in Beijing than to what happened in all of the Central and East European cities put together. China, which at least purports still to be a socialist country, has produced the biggest economic surprise of our lifetimes. This chart shows China's gross domestic product of a percentage of the US GDP in two different measures, purchasing power parity adjusted and current dollar terms. On the PPP basis, China's already a larger economy than the United States. It overtook it in 2014, according to the IMF's data. On the current dollar basis, it probably will overtake the United States unless there's a drastic change in the growth rates in the two countries in about 10 years' time. Now remember, what differentiates China from the Soviet Union is that China's reformers, beginning with Deng Xiaoping, allowed a private sector to flourish, so to speak, around the core of state-owned enterprises. And so the non-state sector contributes around 2/3 of China's growth and 8/10 of all new jobs. And we heard yesterday from a product of that extraordinary economic revolution, it has been a triumph by almost any measure, except the kind of measure that Smith might have asked us to apply. Unlike Europe, China has been able to build technology companies comparable in size to the big technology companies of the United States. These are not state-owned enterprises, folks. They are extraordinary achievements of Chinese private enterprise. And if you haven't been to Hangzhou or Shenzhen, if you haven't spent time seeing what the Chinese tech sector can do, then you haven't really understood what has happened in the world, particularly what has happened since China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, which created, I think, the foundation for this period of extraordinary innovation. But, and I think this hasn't been remarked on nearly enough in Western coverage, under Xi Jinping, China has significantly changed direction. The government's goal has been to beef up the state-owned enterprises. The government has tended to constrain the big tech companies in ways that they complain about when you have lunch or dinner with the leaders. There was a period when, although it's recently changed, it was clear that credit was flowing disproportionately to the state-owned sector, and private sector companies were struggling to satisfy their credit needs at reasonable rates. This is Nick Lardy's recent study on the subject. I want to emphasize that that trend has changed, not least because the government has had a big shock in the last couple of years in terms of its own economic problems. I want to conclude, bringing us back really to Smith, that the key issue here that we need to focus on, and it's a timely thing to focus on given events in Hong Kong, is not so much democracy as the rule of law. The real distinction, it seems to me, between China's system and the system of the United States, or indeed of the European Union, is the fundamental limitation on the rule of law that exists in China. The World Justice Project assigns scores for different measures of legal order. efficiency of the criminal justice system, regulatory enforcement, and so forth. And if you compare the United States and China, here the United States is orange, China's in blue, only by the measure of order and security is China ahead of the United States. By all the measures that we probably attach more importance to in the West, fundamental rights, openness of government, absence of corruption, and so forth, China is significantly behind the United States. I included Sweden in this chart just as a reminder that the United States long ago ceased to be the gold standard for rule of law. It's actually, by almost every measure, inferior to the North European democracies. But that, I think, should only emphasize the point. What matters in the end is not whether you're socialist or capitalist. That, I think, has become a false dichotomy. What really matters is whether you have the rule of law or not. China has indeed succeeded, as every politician says in every speech, I'm kind of bored of it now, in pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and this is the greatest achievement in human history. Yes. But those people who have been pulled out of poverty and have become middle class in the last 30 years in China find that they do not have property rights in the way that we understand them in the West, nor can they allocate their capital freely as they would if they lived in the West. And that is why the entire Chinese system exists behind not just a great firewall to exclude foreign internet content, it also exists behind a firewall of capital controls, which, were they to be removed, would allow a vast outflow of capital from China to the rest of the world as China's middle class and upper middle class sought to differentiate or diversify, rather, their portfolios. That seems to me one of the most glaring illustrations of the fundamental weakness of the Chinese system. We as educators need to explain more than we have done in the past 30 years the connection historically from socialism to lawlessness. What is happening in Venezuela today was not hard to predict. Indeed, I remember predicting it when I visited Venezuela while writing Civilization, now 10 years ago. And yet so many of the Hollywood socialist types defended Hugo Chavez's regime. So too did Jeremy Corbyn, glamorized it even as it hollowed out the rule of law and set that country on a course to disaster. Socialism with Chinese characteristics has absolutely classic characteristics when it comes to the rule of law. And if you don't believe me, look at these photographs of the so-called re-education camps that have been created for China's Muslim Uyghur minority population, or reflect on what is happening in Hong Kong these days. Socialism is fundamentally about absence of rule of law. Once it crosses that line from social democracy to true socialism, where the means of production must be controlled by the state, and where the planner that Smith mocked in the theory of moral sentiments becomes so powerful that he or she almost inevitably perpetrates injustice. The reality that this model produces corruption as well as abuses of power is a reality we cannot emphasize enough when we try to teach people the history of the last 200 years. Let's not forget also, at a time when the young